Race realism, at least in terms of the IQ argument, can seem fairly compelling on the surface. When we look at distinct populations within the USA, for example, we do find there to be, I believe it's 15 to 18 point IQ difference, according to some studies. It varies, I think that's at the high end, between the white population and the black population. When we look internationally and look at the average IQs of particular nations, you can see a difference. So, on the face of it, on the surface, to a shallow interpretation, it would seem that there's something to it, and IQ does indeed correlate to a whole bunch of other stuff. Basically, how successful you're likely to be in life, particularly in our technological, mind-centered societies where intelligence is probably the most important. But this is a really shallow interpretation, and it misses out on a whole host of factors and things. It's just simplistic, and it seems to basically be an excuse, at least for a lot of people, to be horrible racists. And I don't think that is a safe and secure point from which to operate. So let's take a look at it, while trying really hard not to be a condescending and horrible cunt. Now, hopefully we're all aware that there are problems with the whole conceit of IQ, that general intelligence is extremely hard to measure, that there are cultural problems with a lot of the older tests and so on that made them less fair, less accurate in testing general intelligence. These things have been fixed in later iterations and so on to an extent, that they're particularly inaccurate when talking about children. Yeah, there's a whole host of issues with IQ, but it's the only real measure that we have. It's all we have to go on. It's where people are making this argument, so that's important. So let's just take it as read that IQ is... We understand the problems with IQ, and we're just going ahead and we're using it anyway for the sake of argument. So the first thing we need to talk about is heritability. Now, part of the problem, and part of the reason it was important to highlight issues in measuring IQ, is that IQ is much less accurate the younger someone is. You have to compensate and adjust IQ. And this is probably part of the reason why the heritability of your IQ is hard to measure and changes over time. It ranges from, I believe, 0.25 out of 1 all the way up to 0.75 out of 1 as you get older. So the apparent heritability, the relationship between your parents' intelligence and your intelligence increases as you get older, which is a little strange. So that's an issue. Also, the heritability of IQ, when we measure it, two intelligent parents do not necessarily produce an equally or more intelligent child. Intelligence trends to the mean, which means if you get two intelligent people and they have a kid, that kid is much more likely to be less intelligent than both of them and more towards the 100. If you get two stupid people and they have a kid, their kid is not more likely to be stupider than they are or equally stupid. They're likely to be more intelligent, trending towards the mean, more towards 100. So those are issues as well. Heritability is measured anywhere from 0.25 to 0.75, 0.4, so 40% roughly is what we often see bandied about. But that leaves 60%, the majority, or at least a significant minority, even if you take the statistics the other way, that isn't down to heritability. So this is already a kind of a blow to the idea of racial intelligence, because if it's not particularly that heritable, save in the most general sense possible, then why would we see racial variations to that extent? So that's a problem right off the bat. Defining what a race even is extremely difficult. We all think we know what it is, but what is it really? I mean, practically every group of humans in the world has traits that are found in other groups of humans in the world. If you swab your cheek and send your DNA off, you'll find you've got DNA from everywhere. Sub-Saharan Africa, Vikings, whatever. People get around and they fuck a lot. So these supposedly distinct populations are definitely, at the very least, widely blurred at the edges. It's extremely difficult to say there's a race here, and there's more variation within a race than there is between races. So this is difficult. But there are things that, we're humans, we recognize differences in each other to such a high extent, much more than other animals do. So we're hypersensitive to this. Certain things are more obvious, the amount of melanin, the epicanthic fold, things like that. But when it comes down to actual differences between the races, they're extremely small. They really only come into play at the extremes. So, Olympic sprinters all tend to come from a particular West African heritage, if I'm remembering correctly, and that's due to a slight difference in the amount of twitch muscle mass that they have. But that's an extreme edge. That's Olympian before it makes any meaningful difference. The other places we see relatively meaningful differences are also similar edge cases, like transplants and rejection rates, things like that, minor differences in prevalences of particular diseases and so on. But otherwise, there is virtually no real difference between one race and another. We can all interbreed. It's not species, it's not subspecies. It's, to all intents and purposes, meaningless. So if there is any real difference in intelligence, it's likely to exist at the extreme ends. So one race or another might have a fraction of a percent more morons or a fraction of a percent more hyper-intelligent people. And that's where you're going to see the difference, not in the general mass of the population. Well, okay then, you might ask. If the differences between the races are so meaningless, why do we have this differential in IQ between different racial groups? Well, I think that probably, almost certainly, comes down to other factors. There are many things that can affect your intelligence. Some of them relate to culture, some of them relate to diet, some of them relate to access to education, and so on. In fact, we've seen the average IQ rise in Western nations, though that's starting to stall out over time. This is called the Flynn Effect, and we've seen that similar effect happening in these racial subcategories that people like to pick on. And the gap has narrowed between the white population in the States and the black population in the States. So why might that be? What is the Flynn effect? There's lots of speculation about this, but we do know that certain things do have an effect on IQ. Your access to education and your participation in education affects your IQ. Nutrition is incredibly important. Especially since it can have a long-term effect. If you're relatively malnourished or poorly nourished as a child, that will have a long-term effect on your intelligence and your nervous system more broadly. This is why imposing veganism on children is such a horrendously bad idea, because it can affect their development throughout their entire life. And so it goes for other things. A poor diet, if you're relatively impoverished and you're only eating fast foods or whatever, that can have a negative effect on your intelligence, over time. So it's not a huge leap to see how access to decent education, access to decent diet, might adversely affect certain populations more than others. Black people in the United States are, if I remember correctly, 5 times more likely to be impoverished than whites. This also directly correlates to the arrest rates and so on. So that's another factor you have to consider when you try and imply that blacks are more criminal or whatever. We see a similar rise in the white poor population as we do in the black poor population. So the operating factor at work here appears to be poverty, and I don't think that really surprises anybody, or shouldn't surprise anybody. It's been well known for a long time. But when you're poor, you have less access to nutrition, so your intelligence is likely to be lower on that factor. When you're poorer and you live in bad areas because that's all you can afford, access to education is relatively restricted. Access to decent education is relatively restricted. Cultures often spring up in these areas that are anti-intellectual, anti-education, people who feel that that's not something that offers them anything. So you end up with a cultural reinforcement. And in the end, this becomes a self-perpetuating cycle. if you grow up in a poor situation, you're less likely to be intelligent, you're less likely to have access to education, you're less likely to get out of that situation. And so you and your family and your kids and whatever are going to be born into that same situation, and so it cycles and cycles again. This is one of these poverty traps, and it affects the white population as well. It affects everybody. Poverty is a trap. Our societies in the US and the UK, to a slightly lesser extent, do not allow you to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, save by the most massive amount of luck possible. We have this myth that you can do it, that anyone can succeed, but the decks are often stacked against people, and they're stacked against people regardless of race. It's just we have certain historical issues that haven't been dealt with in a fair or balanced way, and so they adversely affect certain population groups more than others. But this explains the gap. The lack of access to education, the lack of access to proper nutrition, and the increasingly entrenched cultures within these impoverished groups that are anti-education and maybe have traditions of bad nutrition, of fast food, things that aren't good for you, things that used to be slave foods or poor population foods, aren't necessarily good for nurturing intelligence. So that explains the gap without recourse to race, which does not appear to be, and we have no reason to think it would be, any kind of major factor whatsoever. And if you are a white supremacist, this isn't a good argument for you to make, because Asian peoples tend to score higher on IQ tests than we do, particularly Japan and China. They have cultures that are extremely pushy when it comes to education, which seems to be the big factor there, and lots of sacrifices are made for both the elderly and kids within these cultures to ensure that they grow up well and they push themselves as hard as possible to succeed. So that explains it. It's not race, it's culture, it's nutrition, it's class, it's all of these factors, much more obviously than it is anything else. And that's good news for you, because it means you're not genetically inherently stupid either. I was going to include a bunch of references, but I think I'm not. I'm going to encourage you to investigate these things for yourselves. Investigate the Flynn effect, investigate the effect of nutrition on intelligence, both short-term and long-term. Investigate the effect of class and wealth on intelligence, of education. Look into experiments they've done in Africa, where they go to relatively malnourished, impoverished communities, and the difference that merely handing out a spoonful of meat can make to kids' intelligence and alertness and awareness. And you'll see for yourself that these things are far more important than race could ever be. And if, hey, you want to make a positive difference to your nation, your country, your people, what you should be doing is not looking to deport all the darkies. What you should be doing is looking to encourage social investment, educational investment, nutritional investment. You should be arguing for school breakfasts, school dinners. You should be arguing for better pay for teachers, more teachers, better schools. These are the things that you should be arguing for, not expelling people of a slightly different shade to you. Zang.